All right, next up we have Matt Barton, who became the curator of recorded sound at the Library of Congress in 2008. From 1996 to 2003, he was production coordinator of the Alan Lomax Collection CD series. He has written extensively on recorded music and sound. From 2016 to 2018, he was president of the Association for Recorded Sound Collections and is currently the chair of ARSC Publications Committee. Matt Barton.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. I got the idea to do a presentation on what I'll call the first days of disco. That covers a lot of ground, but I'm really just going to be looking at the music itself. Last year, I was called on to contribute to an exhibit on the disco era that was going on at the Library of Congress in DC. And as I gathered material, I was intrigued because I was around for the disco era. I was in high school for it. And what I was intrigued about was how many of the records early on, and I'm talking 72, 73, 74, before it's truly mainstream, I knew in other contexts, mainly from hearing them on progressive rock stations in Boston and not realizing that they'd been launched in discos. So, well, that's what brought me here. Now, Carrie was a little bit worried about culture shock between the two styles here, so we're going to ease into the subject, and we are going to hear some high energy and even frenetic music. But let's start with something gentle. Here's Judy Garland in 1939. Zing went the strings of my heart. It should be right here. Okay. I'm right on it here. I don't know why I'm not getting anything. Well, I do. Oh my.
Is the volume up?
Wait a minute. I don't. We had it. Yeah. Okay.
When you smiled at me, I heard a melody. It haunted me from the start. Something inside of me started a symphony. Sing with the strings of my heart.
Okay, now like a good disco DJ, I'm going to accelerate the tempo a bit and bring us up to 1958.
Dear,
with the
when
coasters.
you smile at me, I heard a melody. It haunted me from the start. Something inside of me started a symphony. Sing with the string of my heart.
Okay, and then we're going to skip ahead to 1972, the first record by The Tramps, later to give us Disco Inferno and a lot of other classics. This is their version of Zing with the Strings of My Heart. And if this sounds like the classic disco sound to you, not an accident. The bass singer and drummer was Earl Young, who created the 4 on the floor disco beat. I think they knew the Coasters record. Now, this was a hit, not a huge hit, but a hit nevertheless, and it launched the Tramps on their way. Now, when your group puts out a cover version of something, it's a good move to put one of your own compositions on the other side, and therefore you collect at least half off of it. And so that's what they did. This track was called Penguin at the Big Apple. I don't know if you can read that. Penguin at the Big Apple. I should have put them side to side. You'd see that the time is exactly the same. That's because this is simply the backing track for the A-side. But good move. Is Tim Brooks here? We could consider the copyright ramifications of that. Well, that's another thing. So that was an early hit, and it got played in the discos of the day. It was already a happening scene. A disco was a place you went. It wasn't a recognized style of music, even though early on you do have things like that really, fit our idea of what disco was. But you also, the DJ was all important, and it was highly competitive to get records that nobody else had that would just excite the dancers, more and more. And a good early example of one of those is this, Barabbas. This is a rock band from Spain. The members were from Spain, the Philippines, Cuba, and Portugal. This album was released in Spain in '72. American DJs picked up on it in '73. And one of the tracks that was really hot was Woman. That's the cover in Spain. On right, that's the American issue. You used to see that record all the time around New York and Boston.
Every time I see that woman, every time I see that girl, secret feelings come inside me. Something's burning in my head. I see that woman.
And the other track that registered strongly in discos is called Wild Safari. We'll hear a little bit of that from, this is the middle portion. We'll try and hear it. Let's see. There we go. Another unlikely early disco hit was this track, The Mexican by Babe Ruth. It was recorded in England in '71 and released there. It wasn't released in the States until '73, and DJs got a hold of it. Babe Ruth, if you want to check out a band that you might not know who were really pretty good, all of their albums are available on CD, and they were kind of a combination of progressive rock and a blues band. And they like to do things like perform Ennio Morricone themes at their shows, and this is an example of that. Actually, they took Morricone's theme for a few dollars more and wrote some lyrics about the Battle of the Alamo, and this is what it sounded like. To skip back to the 50s again. Big Al Downing, that's him on piano. Big Al Downing and the Pocats, they're best known, best remembered for being Wanda Jackson's backing band. Toured with her, and they're the band on her big hit, Let's Have a Party. And they recorded on their own, and I like to call this record from 1958 the best record that Little Richard never recorded.
The bobber with the mule down on the farm, down on the farm, down on the farm. bus, down on the farm, down on the farm, down on the farm, rock and roll taking over my heart.
Now, Al Downing continues to tour and record through the 1960s. I guess in that period, really call him a journeyman. He's usually working in a rhythm and blues or a soul vein. And by the 1970s, he signed to Janus, which was part of the Chess organization of labels at that time. And in early 1974, he cut this single, which is a solid Southern soul record of the time. Notice it's 2 minutes and 50 seconds long. This is the first version that was released. Let's hear a little bit of it.
Baby, I've been loving you for a long time. I watched him play games with you, talked about you, and lied about you just as though you didn't mean nothing to him at all. But if you only give me a chance, I'll change it. When your life full of trouble and you're down, can't find your way.
Okay, not much happens when that record is released, but it does start to get some disco play. And by this time, the labels have learned that if you want play in the disco, you've got to have a longer record than 2 minutes and 50 seconds. And so they bring in a gentleman named Tom Moulton, who's gathered quite a reputation for doing this. Moulton started supplying tapes to discos and nightclubs around New York that were just his compilations of records, but he would take a record, put it to tape, and get to work with a razor blade, extended, double up parts, and make them much longer, much more dancer friendly. And that's what he did here. It's now 5 minutes and 35 seconds long. By this time, he was getting access to the actual tapes of these things, so he could take the backing tracks and extend them and, bring instruments to the front, do all kinds of things. So the first thing that happens with this record, which, had maybe a 6 or 7 second intro, is it now has a 90-second intro. We'll hear a bit of that. Also pumped up the bass as much as he could on a 7-inch record. This record led to the advent of the 12-inch single. Okay, and so that goes on like that for 90 seconds, building and building, and then finally you get Al down.
I know you heard things about me, but I'm here to let you know that I'm the one that you can believe in. You see, I'll be your light in a sea of darkness. I'll be your sunshine after the rain. All you gotta do.
Okay, and he gave it a 90-second intro. He also gave it about a 90-second outro, and we'll hear some of that. Oh, there is, that's him. He also worked as a model. And on the right, I don't know for sure. John Brovin, who knows Tom Moulton, has promised to ask him for me. This may be the first time that Moulton's name appears on a record. I can't swear to that, but it might be. So let's hear some of that outro. Might be a banjo, might also be an electric sitar. Can't quite decide. But definitely meant to sound like a banjo. This was a big disco hit, big R&B chart hit, also crossed over to the pop charts, though not the top 40. And Al Downing actually had rather mixed feelings about it, and he started to move away from this because at heart he was actually a rockabilly and country singer. And he moved into that field and actually did pretty well. These are some of his later works, and there he is appearing on Hee Haw with Buck Owens. Around the same time, here are the Tramps. This album came out in 1975, and it's a very much a Tom Moulton production. The Tramps had moved on. They were on the Atlantic label by now, but Buddha had these early hits on them, plus some unreleased material, and they gave it to Moulton to refashion into a disco-friendly album, although it was already pretty disco-friendly. But I don't know how well you can read. The first track is a combination of Penguin the Big Apple and Zing Went the Strings of My Heart. It's become 4 minutes and 50 seconds long, and that's thanks to another 90-second intro taken from that instrumental side. About this time, B.B. King goes to Philadelphia, records an album that's kind of a combination of his well-known style and the Philadelphia International style of the time. Earl Young is the drummer. And in Young's telling, one day, BB just came in, the rhythm section was there, and he said, let's jam. And the tape was rolling, and they came up with a 6.5 track, simply called Philadelphia. A single version of it was released about half that length, but it took off in the discos, was a strong disco hit, and also a strong hit for BB King. We'll hear a little bit of it. About the same time that he's recording in Philadelphia, Gil Scott-Heron and Brian Jackson are recording the classic Winter in America album, and the best known track on this is In the Bottle, and it becomes a favorite of disco disc jockeys. Let's hear a little bit of that. Oops. No?
Uno,
There we go.
dos, uno, dos, tres, cuatro.
That a lot on WBCN, the main rock station in Boston at the time. That was just when I was starting to listen to music and buy records and all that. So Strata East was a jazz label and not really well positioned to promote a single, though they did release one on that. Somebody who was well positioned to release a single was Sylvia Robinson, who was the Sylvia of Mickey and Sylvia, and by this time had her own label and was doing pretty well with it in New Jersey. She gets a group of musicians together, and in classic pop music, indie label tradition, they get out a cover of it, and that's the one that really takes off. Strong disco hit, strong R&B chart hit, top 10, and almost makes the national top 40. And it was just, the groove was just too good to give up. So late in the year, the great salsa artist Joe Bataan releases an instrumental version of it. Oops. Releases an instrumental version of it. That comes out December 1974. He hand-delivered acetates of it to DJs around New York, and it really took off, though it was not, I don't think it was a major hit much outside of the New York area, but let's hear a little bit. Getting her next disco hit ready. She's written a song called Shame, 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 which owes just a little bit to a Jimmy Reed song of the same name. And she wants to cut it with an artist she has named Jesus Alvarez, but decides it's going to work better with a man and a woman singing it. So she calls on Shirley Goodman, who is the Shirley of Shirley and Lee of Let the Good Times Roll fame. Here it is, Shame, Shame, Shame. Massive pop and disco hit. Definitely started in the discos, though, in December of 1974. And notice the flip side there is simply an instrumental track. You know, DJs, you have 2 discs and, you know, just go back and forth. You can keep it going as long as you wanted to. Again, this is before the 12-inch single, became common currency in discos. Let's check it out. Had to include that, you know. Okay, so we're in December 1974, and Murray Brooks, the disc jockey who broke Barabbas in the discos a couple of years before, gets a gift from a friend who's coming back from Venezuela. He has the new Barabbas album, and it's got this track called Hijack on it. And he starts pushing it and gets a great response to it. Let's hear what that sounds like. He's probably the only one in New York who has a copy at this point. And while Barabbas is considering a couple of offers from different labels to get their record out in the States, Atlantic, which has been wanting Herbie Mann to cut a disco record for them, gets him in the studio. This is within a week, 10 days of Brooks breaking the record. And by January, Herbie Mann's out there with this version of Hijack. Both versions were strong hits in the discos, but it's Herbie Mann's record that crosses over, became a major hit for him. Which he, to his credit, he seemed to be in a loop there. To his credit, he reached out to Barabbas and appeared as a guest star on their next album. And around the same time, Babe Ruth, whose lineup had changed significantly, they still had their great lead singer, Jenny Han, at this point, had another album out there. Now, Barabbas was aware that they had been getting over the discos. I don't think Babe Ruth ever was, not from what I can tell. But their new album has this track on it called Elusive, and the DJs love it, and they jump on it. Here's what the intro sounds like. About 6 minutes and 40 seconds long, which is a good length for a disco number, and it's got a long outro, so they could, fade it as need be.
Thought I saw you on a train. Could be my imagination. So I turned.
And we'll skip to the middle here. Capitol had this promo label putting disco at the top, and sometimes the records were, anybody would have called them disco at that point, but in the case of a Babe Ruth, it wasn't always obvious, so they wanted to get that word on there. That's another shot of the group at the time, and this is from the middle of the record here. We're in late 1975 now, and disco hits are getting pretty mainstream, and there's a musical style and sound that is immediately recognized as disco. And there will be outliers and oddities for the next few years, but it's much more of a pop mainstream phenomenon at this point, though. In the clubs, in the discotheques, it's often a different scene than what you're getting on the radio. But I'm going to leave you with an example of gospel disco. And this was a big hit, The Mighty Clouds of Joy, recorded in Philadelphia, again with Earl Young, and gave us this record that started in the discos in December of '75 and crossed over, became a major R&B hit and a strong top 40 hit. Mighty Clouds of Joy with Mighty High. All right, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Matt. Any questions for Matt while we're changing out and getting ready for the next presentation? Yes.
Thank you. Matt, you more or less answered the question I was formulating, except perhaps something semantic.
Okay.
I attend your presentations out of my abiding respect for you, and
Thank you.
did not expect to be here because of a deep connection I feel with disco music.
Yeah.
Yet this has been revelatory.
Rob, everybody knows this jazz thing is just a front.
No response to that. I mean, I am open-minded, but this has been revelatory insofar as if you put me in an airless room with a 40-watt bulb and I could only listen to the early titles you were playing, I would not regard it as purgatory. Unless I had to subsist on lima beans. But the thing I was wondering was, you talked about how disco became mainstream, and I was thinking about all the West Coast musicians churning out Dixieland in the 1950s that drained it of its juice. Yeah. And so I was wondering if what I'm remembering really not so much as mainstream, but a trivialization of disco, because the records you played seemed to have much more gravitas than I associate with disco.
Yeah, well, like I said, and later on, the deeper records are still there, and I'll when I was in high school and things like, there was a disco version of the I Love Lucy theme that was a hit, and, a lot of other things like that, friends of mine who were into it say, like, you got to come to come with me to the disco. It's not really like that. It's much better. And I thought I had it all figured out. I went to discos a handful of times. I was not into it, but it's true. There was what you had on the radio, and then there were the clubs, and there was some overlap there. The disco between the disco scene. And the radio, and of course later on there were discos that just emphasized the big radio hits, but yeah, I wouldn't. I think the Dixieland comparison is an interesting one. I mean, you have, although one aspect of it I think would be that in disco you had both artists like the Tramps or Rose Royce or Casey and the Sunshine Band. These were intact bands. Often, creating their own material, and then you had, the studio side of it, and they churned out a lot of stuff. Not all of it was good. One thing, I love that version by the Tramps of Zing Went the Strings of My Heart, but, one thing you find throughout the 70s are really cheesy disco versions of songs of that era. I mean, there was, I'm thinking like versions of songs like Tangerine and Chattanooga Choo Choo and so on. There was really an awful lot of stuff like that.
One more just short question.
Okay, yeah. Anyone?
Matt, I shall look at my copy of the Coasters' Zing Went the Strings of My Heart in a totally different light. Matt, excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Very interesting. I could hear in the records that you played certainly the rhythms and beat of James Brown, and also Lionel Whitfield, the Temptations, Papa was a Rolling Stone. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And an interesting thing in that era is that groups like the Temptations, who were starting to have fewer major top 40 hits, are still getting heavy play in the discos, and not the older songs, but new ones, and some of them are in the long form, like Papa Was a Rolling Stone. And James Brown in this period was still a major hit maker, and for instance, that the Doing It to Death album was a mainstay for disco DJs, and a lot of the other things that were coming out on the People label. So in the early days, James Brown is definitely a force. That's something I didn't touch on, but that's an important point.
All right, thank you, Matt.
Thank you.